The Roman Empire, known for its vast territory and powerful military, built its empire on the backs of disciplined soldiers. The Roman army was an incredibly structured force, with training, loyalty, and discipline being at its core. Soldiers weren't just warriors. They were the embodiment of Roman strength, pride, and authority. To desert this army, to abandon Rome's call, was an act so severe that it would not go unpunished. The consequences of desertion were brutal, savage, and often irreversible. In the early years of the Roman Republic, soldiers were primarily citizens called to duty when the empire needed them. They fought not only for their country, but also for their families and their honor. But as the empire expanded, so did the scope of the wars they fought. Soldiers often found themselves far from home for years, enduring harsh conditions that tested their physical and mental endurance. The further the empire stretched, the harder it became to keep its soldiers committed. The soldiers of Rome were highly trained, often serving for long periods in foreign lands, exposed to the dangers of the battlefield, starvation, disease, and the constant threat of death. The strain of constant warfare, lack of supplies, and fear of enemy forces led some soldiers to question their loyalty. For some, the harsh conditions were simply too much to bear, and desertion seemed like the only way to survive. But leaving the battlefield came at a high price. Desertion in the Roman military was seen as a betrayal, not only of the empire but of one's comrades. A soldier who fled from battle, leaving his fellow soldiers to fight alone, was regarded as the worst kind of coward. The Roman army was not just a military force, it was a brotherhood, bound by loyalty, honor, and the shared mission of conquest. Desertion, therefore, tore at the very fabric of this brotherhood. The penalty for desertion was swift and brutal, designed not only to punish the individual but to serve as a warning to others. One of the most infamous punishments for desertion was decimation. This gruesome practice involved selecting 1 out of every 10 soldiers in a unit by lot, who would then be executed by their fellow soldiers. The remaining soldiers were forced to witness this execution as a reminder of the cost of desertion. This collective punishment was designed to instill fear and maintain discipline within the ranks. It was meant to ensure that the army remained united, and that the soldiers, out of fear of being selected, would remain loyal to their comrades and the empire. In some cases, the punishments could be even more severe. A soldier found guilty of desertion could be stripped of his armor and weapons, and then publicly flogged or beaten. This humiliation was a powerful tool to break the soldier's spirit and show others the price of betrayal. For those who committed the most heinous forms of desertion, or those who were repeat offenders, execution was the only option. Crucifixion, a punishment typically reserved for slaves and criminals, was sometimes used for deserters as a final act of punishment. The crucifixion would often occur in a public space, leaving the deserter's body to rot as a gruesome reminder to others about the consequences of disloyalty. However, desertion was not always the end for a soldier. Some deserters were brought back to the army by force, while others were used as examples of redemption. In the face of such punishments, some soldiers, realizing their mistake, returned to their posts, hoping to prove their loyalty once more. But even then, their fate was uncertain. Once a soldier deserted, their name was often erased from the military register, and they were considered dead to the Roman state. Their families were also stigmatized, as desertion was viewed as a personal and familial failure. The punishment for desertion was not just physical, it was social, psychological, and emotional. Soldiers who returned after desertion were often subjected to mockery and disdain. Even if they had been forgiven and reinstated into the army, they would have to live with the stain of their desertion hanging over them. In some cases, deserters were given the option to fight as gladiators in the arena, where they would be forced to fight for their lives as entertainment for the Roman populace. This cruel fate was one that many soldiers dreaded, as it was seen as a fate worse than death, to live as a mere pawn for the amusement of others. But while desertion was a serious crime, it wasn't always clear-cut. Some soldiers were forced to desert in the face of insurmountable odds. The conditions of war, the brutal climate, and the constant threat of death took their toll. Some soldiers deserted because they believed it was the only way to survive. Others fled because they had lost faith in their leaders or the cause they were fighting for. Still, others found themselves abandoned by their fellow soldiers or left behind due to illness or injury. These circumstances, though understandable, did not absolve them of the punishment they would face. The Roman army was a machine of war that needed to function with precision. Desertion threatened the unity of the army, and Rome could not afford to allow such a weakness to persist. The punishment for desertion was a necessary measure to ensure that the army remained strong, disciplined, and united in its mission. Every soldier's life was expendable for the greater good of the empire, and the fear of such severe punishments ensured that loyalty remained the most important trait in the Roman military. As the empire grew and expanded, so too did the number of soldiers required to maintain its power. The constant need for soldiers meant that desertion was an ongoing issue that had to be addressed. But as Rome's power waned and its military presence was stretched thinner, the brutal punishments for desertion were not enough to maintain order in the ranks. By the time the empire fell, the once feared Roman legions were no longer the terrifying force they once were. Yet, the legends of the harsh penalties for desertion lived on, etched in the annals of history, as a reminder of the lengths the Roman Empire went to in order to maintain its power. The Roman military, known for its precision and discipline, demanded unwavering loyalty from its soldiers. Desertion, however, was not just a personal failure, it was a threat to the very structure of the Roman war machine. The empire depended on its legions to maintain its power, expand its borders, and suppress rebellion. The repercussions for soldiers who tried to escape war were severe. But for the Roman state, this brutal system of punishment was a necessary evil to preserve order. One of the most notorious forms of punishment for desertion was decimation, a punishment so feared that it served as a deterrent for any soldier thinking of abandoning his comrades. This punishment was typically enforced when a unit had been severely weakened due to desertion, cowardice, or disobedience. In decimation, 1 out of every 10 men was selected by lot and executed, often by their fellow soldiers. This punishment was meant to be both a form of justice and a tool for maintaining morale. The brutality of decimation, where soldiers were forced to kill their comrades, was designed to instill fear and ensure loyalty. The act of decimation, however, was not without its own psychological toll. Soldiers who had to participate in the execution of their comrades were deeply scarred by the experience. The Roman army, already a brutal institution, took measures to ensure its soldiers remained loyal to one another, even if that meant forcing them into horrific situations. The soldiers knew the consequences of desertion, and yet, even in the face of this grim punishment, some would still try to escape. Roman generals who were responsible for the well-being of their troops had a heavy burden to carry. They had to balance the fear of punishment with the need to keep morale high. The constant pressure of maintaining discipline and preventing desertion led to some of the most severe tactics in military history. While decimation was the most infamous, it wasn't the only form of punishment for desertion. For soldiers who attempted to flee, beheading was another common punishment. If a soldier deserted before or during battle, there was little mercy. If captured, the deserter's head was often severed from their body as a public display of the consequences for abandoning Rome. The heads of traitors were sometimes put on spikes or displayed in public places to serve as a warning to others. The severed heads of deserters were gruesome symbols of Rome's ruthlessness and authority, meant to remind everyone that the empire would never tolerate disloyalty. Another horrific punishment for desertion was crucifixion, which was traditionally reserved for slaves, criminals, and the lowest ranks of society. For soldiers, however, it represented a particularly harsh form of retribution. Crucifixion was a slow and painful death, designed to be as agonizing as possible. It was often carried out in a public space, where the body would be left to hang for days, a macabre warning to any soldier thinking about fleeing. This punishment was not only a physical torment, but also a humiliating public spectacle. Roman citizens and soldiers alike would witness the punishment of deserters, reinforcing the idea that loyalty was paramount in the eyes of Rome. The brutal nature of Roman punishments didn't end with the execution of deserting soldiers. Flogging was another punishment used by Roman military leaders to deter desertion. Soldiers found guilty of attempting to escape were often subjected to brutal beatings, sometimes with a scourge, a whip with multiple lashes. This punishment was designed to humiliate the soldier, breaking their spirit before they faced execution or other consequences. The public nature of the flogging served as a stark reminder that the Roman state would tolerate no disobedience. However, it wasn't just the soldiers who faced consequences for desertion. Their families could also suffer for their actions. In some instances, a soldier's family was publicly humiliated or punished for the soldier's desertion. The Roman military saw this as a way of ensuring that the disgrace of desertion extended beyond the individual. This was a harsh reminder that betrayal was not only a personal failure, but one that affected everyone connected to the soldier. Families of deserters could lose their property or be marked with the same stigma that their loved one carried. For many, the fate of the soldier was just as terrible as the fate of their family, who often had to live in shame for their loved one's actions. Despite the harsh penalties, desertion continued to plague the Roman military, particularly during times of prolonged warfare. Soldiers often found themselves far from home, isolated and exhausted by the endless cycle of battle. The psychological toll on the soldiers was immense, and some would try to flee in desperation. For many soldiers, the idea of returning home and escaping the horrors of war was simply too powerful to resist. In an attempt to counter desertion, Roman leaders introduced various strategies to keep their soldiers motivated. Rewards for bravery, loyalty, and service were used to keep soldiers focused on the long-term goal. Soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle or showed exceptional courage were often given land, money, or even political favors. These rewards, however, were not always enough to offset the hardships of war. Some soldiers, particularly in the later years of the empire, became disillusioned with their cause, and desertion rates grew. Even as the Roman Empire declined, the brutal punishments for desertion remained a part of its military culture. The army continued to use fear and violence to maintain control, long after the empire's power had waned. The lessons of the Roman army, particularly its approach to desertion, influenced military cultures for centuries to come. The fear of punishment, the pressure to maintain discipline, and the relentless drive to preserve the empire were all central to the Roman military's success. But in the end, the very things that made the Roman military so powerful, its discipline, its loyalty, and its harsh treatment of deserters, also contributed to its decline. As the empire fell into chaos, the once feared legions were no longer the unstoppable force they had been. Yet the legacy of their brutal punishments endured, reminding us of the savage consequences that awaited those who dared to flee from the Roman war machine.